Before clocks ticked on walls or glowed beside our beds, time moved differently. You're listening to Made for Sleep, where history unfolds gently and without urgency. Tonight, we explore how ancient people understood time, not in minutes and alarms, but through shadows, seasons, and the quiet rhythm of the natural world. Let the rain keep its steady pace as the story drifts. And if you'd like, feel free to follow us and let me know how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening from. Long before anyone counted seconds or checked a wrist for the hour, people lived inside time rather than measured it. The sun rose, shadows stretched and shrank, and seasons turned the world from green to gold to white and back again. Tonight, you're going back to when time was something you felt in your bones, read in the sky, and trusted to the rhythms that pulse through everything alive. You wake before dawn in a world that has no numbers for what happens next. There's no alarms screaming from a nightstand, no glowing digits announcing that you're late or early or exactly on schedule. You wake because your body knows. The air has changed. The birds have started their racket in the trees outside your dwelling, whatever form that dwelling takes, whether it's hide stretched over poles, mud bricks stacked and dried, or stone fitted together with the patience of generations. Your eyes open to darkness that's not quite as dark as it was an hour ago. You can't say an hour ago because hours don't exist yet, but you know the difference between deep night and the softening that comes before dawn. You've known it your whole life. Your grandparents knew it. Everyone you've ever met knows it. The darkness has texture, and you read it the way someone in a future time will glance at a screen. You don't leap up. There's no rushing because there's nothing to be late for in the way lateness will eventually be understood. You rise when your body says you've rested enough, when the light says it's time to see, and when the work ahead becomes more pressing than the comfort of staying horizontal. Maybe you're a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, sleeping on a reed mat in a one-room house that smells like bread and lamp oil. Maybe you're a hunter in northern Europe, wrapped in furs in a longhouse where 20 other people are starting to stir, coughing and murmuring and rebuilding the fire that's burned down to embers. You step outside, and the sky is doing what it always does, performing the most reliable show in existence. In the east, the horizon is turning from black to deep blue, to a blue that's almost purple, and you don't need anyone to tell you that the sun will be up soon. You've seen this happen thousands of times. You could probably predict within the span of a few breaths exactly when that first bright edge will appear, but you don't think of it as a prediction. You think of it as knowing, the same way you know that stones are hard and water is wet. The rooster, if you have one, starts screaming its head off right on schedule. Roosters are excellent timekeepers, which is both useful and deeply annoying. If you don't have a rooster, you have some other marker, the particular bird that always sings first, the way the neighbour's dog starts barking, the smell of someone else's fire already burning, because there's always someone who wakes before you, someone whose rhythms run a little faster. You look at the sky, because the sky's the closest thing you have to a universal reference point. Everyone everywhere can see it, assuming it's not cloudy, and even when it's cloudy, you know it's still up there doing its thing. The sun is the obvious star of this show, but it's not the only performer. You've been watching the moon your entire life, watching it swell and shrink, disappear and return, and tracking its journey across the darkness. You know without anyone teaching you, because everyone teaches you just by living, that the moon's changes match up with other cycles. Women's bodies follow the moon, roughly. Tides follow the moon, if you live anywhere near the ocean. Even some animals seem to coordinate their behaviour with lunar phases, though you might not think of it in those terms. You just notice that certain fish show up when the moon is fat, or that the hunting is better in the dark of the moon, when prey can't see you coming. Someone in your community is probably the designated sky watcher, the person who pays closer attention than most, who notices patterns that others miss. Maybe it's an elder who's had decades to observe. Maybe it's a priest or priestess whose job involves knowing when to hold ceremonies. Maybe it's just someone who's naturally curious and spends their evenings staring upward instead of collapsing into sleep. This person knows things. They know that certain stars appear at certain times of the year. They know that the sun doesn't rise in the exact same spot every morning. It shifts along the horizon, creeping north, creeping south, marking the seasons more accurately than any calendar. They know that if you watch the same star over the course of a year, it will seem to move through the sky in a predictable pattern, rising earlier, setting later, disappearing for a while, then coming back. You don't know the word astronomy, because that word won't be invented for thousands of years, but you're doing astronomy. You're doing it with your naked eyes, and your memory, and your willingness to pay attention to the same things night after night, year after year, generation after generation. The sun breaks the horizon, and you don't check anything to confirm this. You don't look at a device. You just notice that the world is suddenly touched with gold, that the shadows are being born, and that the temperature is about to start rising. You have work to do, and the sun has just told you to begin. By the time the sun is fully up, you're already doing something. Feeding animals, grinding grain, checking traps, nursing a baby, sharpening tools, and starting a fire if you let yours go out overnight. The morning has a particular quality of light and energy. Things feel possible. The heat hasn't built up yet if you're in a warm climate. The cold hasn't deepened if you're somewhere winter is brutal. You're not alone in whatever you're doing. Other people are moving through their own routines, and you can hear them. Voices calling to each other, animals making their various noises, the sound of work beginning, tools striking, gates opening, water being drawn from wherever you keep it. Someone has probably already noticed that the shadows are getting shorter. If you live in a community that's developed even the simplest time awareness, you might have a stick or a stone or a post planted in the ground specifically for shadow watching. It's not a sundial yet, not in any formal sense, but it's the ancestor of a sundial. It's a thing that stands still while its shadow moves, and that movement tells you something. In ancient Egypt, someone figured out you could mark the shadow's length at different times and create a reference system. You could say, when the shadow reaches this mark, it's time to stop working and eat. You could say, when the shadow's at its shortest, the day is half done. You couldn't say noon because that word didn't exist yet, but you could understand the concept. The sun reaches its highest point. The shadow shrinks to almost nothing. Then everything reverses. If you're working in a field, you probably don't have an official shadow stick, but you have your own body. You can see your shadow stretching out in front of you in the early morning, a long dark companion that mimics everything you do. By mid-morning it's shorter. By the time your stomach starts demanding food, your shadow has become a small puddle at your feet. This is useful information. Your shadow tells you whether you have time to finish something before the heat becomes unbearable. It tells you whether you should head back home or push forward to the next task. It tells you, roughly, how much daylight you have left to work with. The Babylonians got fancy with this. They created actual devices, early sundials that divided the day into 12 parts. They picked 12 because they like that number. It divides nicely, and their whole mathematical system was based on sets of 60 and 12. But that's relatively advanced. For most of human history, shadow reading was simpler and more intuitive. You just knew that long shadows meant early or late. Short shadows meant middle. No shadow at all. That weird moment when the sun is directly overhead meant you were living close to the equator, and it was the right time of year, and you should probably find some shade because that sun was not playing around. In northern climates, shadows acted differently. In summer they were short and fleeting. In winter they stretched impossibly long, and the sun barely seemed to climb above the horizon before it started sinking again. You couldn't rely on shadows the same way someone in Egypt or Mesopotamia could, but you could still use them. You could still notice that the quality of light at a particular shadow length meant it was time to bring the animals in, time to start preparing the evening meal, and time to gather the children before dark. Shadows were patient teachers. They didn't rush. They moved at exactly the speed the earth was turning. which is to say they moved imperceptibly in any given moment, but obviously over the span of time you could measure in breaths and tasks. You could watch your shadow while you worked and it would be in the same place. Then you'd get absorbed in what you were doing, and when you looked again, it had shifted. The world had turned. Time had passed, whether you noticed it or not. Some communities built entire structures around shadow watching. At Stonehenge, though you're not necessarily at Stonehenge, you're just aware that this kind of thing happened. Massive stones were arranged to catch the sun at specific moments. On the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the sun would rise in perfect alignment with certain stones, and the shadow it cast would fall in a meaningful direction. This wasn't about telling time in the sense of knowing whether it was 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. This was about marking the extreme points of the sun's yearly journey. This was about saying, the sun has gone as far north as it's going to go. From here on out, the days will get shorter. You probably didn't build Stonehenge yourself, but you understood the principle. The sun moves, shadows follow. If you pay attention, you can use this to organise your life. By late afternoon, your shadow is stretching out again, this time in the opposite direction. The light has changed quality. It's golden now, softer, angled. The air might be cooling down, or it might be holding on to heat depending on the season and the landscape. But you know from the shadows that the day is winding down. You start thinking about evening tasks. You start moving toward home, or toward wherever you'll spend the night. The shadows tell you all of this without saying a word, which is good because shadows are notoriously quiet. You know it's autumn because your body's telling you to eat more. There's a biological imperative kicking in, an ancient instruction that says winter is coming and you need to put on some padding. You're hungrier than you were a month ago. You're drawn to the foods that are ripening now, nuts, late fruits, anything rich and fatty. You also know it's autumn because the air smells different. There's a sharpness to it, a clarity that wasn't there in the thick heat of summer. When you wake up, there might be heavy dew on the grass or frost if you're far enough into the season. The leaves are changing if you're in a place that has deciduous trees. The birds are acting strange, gathering in large flocks, having loud conferences about their upcoming travel plans. You don't call it autumn. You might call it harvest time, or the time when things die back, or the season of gathering. Different cultures had different names and different numbers of seasons. Some places recognised 4, some recognised 6 or more, some divided the year into dry season and wet season, and that was all the distinction necessary. But regardless of what you called it, you felt it. These seasons weren't abstract concepts. They were physical realities that changed everything about your daily existence. In spring, the world woke up. The ground softened. Things started growing. If you were a farmer, this was the busiest time, the planting time, the time when you worked until your back screamed and your hands bled because if you didn't get seeds in the ground now, you wouldn't eat later. The light was increasing. The days were getting longer. You could feel the world tilting toward the sun, though you didn't necessarily think of it that way. You just knew that winter's grip was loosening. Summer meant heat and light and long days of work. Depending on where you lived, summer could be glorious or brutal. In Northern Europe, summer was the good time, the time when you could actually be outside without freezing, when things grew like crazy, when the sun barely set and you could work until you dropped. In the Middle East or North Africa, summer was something to survive, the time when you worked in the early morning and late evening, and hid from the sun during the middle of the day. Winter was the time when everything slowed down. The earth was hard. The plants were dormant or dead. If you'd prepared properly, you had stores of food, grain in jars, dried meat, preserved fruits, and roots buried in sand. If you hadn't prepared properly, you would have been in trouble. Winter was when people died. The very young, the very old, the sick, and the unlucky. Winter didn't care about your plans, but winter was also quiet time, story time, and craft time. When you couldn't work the fields, you worked on other things. You repaired tools, you made clothes, you told the long stories that held your culture together. the ones about where you came from and why things are the way they are. You measured your life in these cycles. You might say, I've seen 20 winters, meaning you were 20 years old, though you probably didn't count that precisely. You might say, we'll do that after the next harvest, meaning in roughly a year. You might say, she was born in the time of high water, and everyone would know what you meant because the river flooded every year at the same time. In Egypt, the entire calendar was based on the Nile's flooding. The year had 3 seasons: inundation, growth, and harvest. When the river flooded, that was the new year, the reset button, the moment when the world began again. You could set your calendar by the flood, and people did for thousands of years. In other places, the calendar reset at different moments. The winter solstice was popular, the shortest day, the day when the sun stopped its southward retreat and began coming back. That was a moment worth celebrating. It meant you'd survived the worst of winter, that light was returning, and that life would continue. You knew the solstices not because someone told you the date, but because you felt them. The day length had been changing for months, and you'd been noticing. You'd watch the sunrise point shift along the horizon. You'd watch the sunset point do the same, and then suddenly they stopped. For a few days the sun rose and set in the same places, then it turned around and started moving in the other direction. That turning point was sacred to many cultures. It was a moment when the cosmic order was reasserting itself, when the sun was being reborn, when you could trust that the patterns would continue. The equinoxes were important too. The 2 moments each year when day and night were of equal length, when the balance was perfect. Spring equinox meant the growing season was truly beginning. The autumn equinox meant winter was on its way. You probably didn't calculate these moments with mathematical precision, but you knew when they were happening. You could feel the balance shift. You could sense when the light had reached its maximum or minimum, when things were about to change direction. And all of this happened without anyone checking a calendar, without anyone needing to know that it was March 20th or September 22nd. The earth kept turning. The seasons kept cycling. You kept paying attention. You're hungry before you decide to be hungry. Your stomach starts making those gurgling sounds. That empty feeling spreads through your middle, and your thoughts start drifting toward food. This happens at roughly the same times every day because your body has an internal clock, and it's been keeping time since before your species learned to walk upright. Ancient people didn't know about circadian rhythms, but they lived them. They knew that certain things happened at certain times without any external prompting. You got tired when the sun went down. You woke when it came up. You got hungry at predictable intervals. Your body temperature fluctuated throughout the day and night. All of this was timekeeping of a sort. Biological timekeeping that happened whether you paid attention to it or not. If you were a woman of childbearing age, you had another clock running, the menstrual cycle, roughly lunar in its length, though not exactly sync to the moon, despite what many people believed. This was a deeply personal timekeeper, one that told you when to expect bleeding, when you might become pregnant, and when your mood might shift in predictable directions. Pregnancy was its own kind of calendar, 10 lunar months from conception to birth, give or take. You could feel the progression. The quickening, that first flutter of movement, happened at a predictable point. The swelling of your belly followed a timeline. Your body was counting down to something momentous, and it let you know where you were in the process. Even sleep had its patterns. You didn't sleep in one long block the way modern people try to. You had first sleep and second sleep, with a wakeful period in the middle of the night. This wasn't insomnia. This was normal. You'd sleep for a few hours after dark, then wake up naturally. You'd lie there in the darkness, thinking, talking quietly if there was someone next to you, maybe getting up to pee or check on the animals or feed the fire. Then you'd drift back into second sleep, which would carry you until dawn. Historians have found references to this pattern in old texts, in legal documents that mention things happening during the wakeful period, and in literature that describes characters' activities between first and second sleep. This was how humans slept for most of history, before artificial light made it possible to stay up late and then crash for 8 hours straight. Your daily rhythms extended beyond your own body. You lived in a community, and the community had rhythms. Someone woke first and started the day. Someone else stayed up latest and banked the fires. Children had their own schedule, which involved maximum energy at times that were inconvenient for exhausted adults. Old people's rhythms might be different. Their sleep lighter, and their waking hours adjusted to bodies that didn't work quite as efficiently as they used to. Animals added their own temporal markers. The rooster crowed at dawn, yes, but also sometimes at 2 in the morning for reasons known only to the rooster. Cows needed milking at roughly the same times each day, and they'd let you know if you were late. Dogs barked when strangers approached, which happened more often at certain times. Nocturnal animals started their rustling and hunting when the sun went down, creating a whole different soundscape after dark. The work itself had a rhythm. Morning work was different from afternoon work. You did the tasks that required clear thinking and good light early. You saved the repetitive stuff for when you were tired. You knew how long things took, not in minutes, but in the feeling of doing them. Grinding enough grain for bread took the length of time it took, and you knew that length in your muscles and bones. Threshing grain had a rhythm you could hear, the regular beat of flails hitting the stalks, the sound of many people working together in a pattern that was almost musical. Weaving had a rhythm, the shuttle passing back and forth, the loom creaking. Even walking had a rhythm that measured distance and time. You knew how many days it took to walk to the next village, and you knew it precisely because you'd done it many times. Sacred time overlaid daily time. There were moments in the day when you were supposed to pray or make offerings, and these moments were marked by natural phenomena. Dawn and dusk were obvious times, threshold moments when the world was changing states. Noon was significant in many traditions, the sun at its height, the moment of maximum light and power. Some cultures prayed 5 times a day, and they determined when to pray by watching the shadows and the position of the sun. The first prayer came at dawn. The second was when the sun was at its height. The third was in the afternoon when shadows were a certain length. The fourth at sunset. The fifth after full darkness had fallen. You didn't need a clock for any of this. You needed eyes and attention and a willingness to participate in the rhythms that surrounded you. Your body was keeping time. The sun was keeping time. The community was keeping time. You were all synchronized to each other and to the turning of the earth, and that was enough. You remember the year of the Great Flood not because someone wrote it down as 2034 BCE, but because you remember the water reaching the top step of the temple, the way everyone had to evacuate to higher ground, and the family whose baby was born on the roof where they'd taken shelter. That's the year of the Great Flood, and everything before and after it gets measured in relation to that event. You remember the winter your grandmother died, the summer when locusts ate half the crops, and the spring when your brother fell out of a tree and broke his arm. These are your temporal landmarks, the stakes you drive into the ground of time to keep everything organized. Every culture did this. Every community had its memorable events that served as reference points. Natural disasters were popular markers. Earthquakes, floods, droughts, and volcanic eruptions. So were political upheavals. The year a new king was crowned, the year invaders came, and the year of the big war. Personal milestones worked too. Births, deaths, marriages, and initiations into adulthood. Instead of saying 5 years ago, you might say the year before the drought, and everyone would know what you meant. Instead of saying next month, you might say after the moon has filled and emptied again. Some societies formalize this memory keeping into king lists and year names. In ancient Mesopotamia, each year was named after a significant event. The year might be called the year King Hammurabi dug the canal, or the year of the great harvest. This created a linear timeline of sorts, a way to keep track of when things happened relative to other things, but for most people memory was less formal and more personal. You kept track of your own life and your family's lives using whatever markers made sense to you. You knew how old you were in a general sense. You'd seen a certain number of winters and passed through certain life stages. You might not know your exact birth date, but you knew the season you were born and maybe the phase of the moon. Children's ages were measured in capabilities rather than years. A child wasn't 5 years old. A child was old enough to help with the animals, or too young to be left alone, or ready to learn a craft. These were functional categories that mattered more than the passage of time in some abstract numerical sense. Elders carried the deep memory, the stories that went back multiple generations. Your grandfather could tell you about his grandfather, and his grandfather could have told him about his grandfather, creating a chain of memory that stretched back 100 years or more. These stories weren't precisely dated, but they preserved important information, where the community came from, what disasters they'd survived, what worked, and what didn't. Oral history is tricky because it changes with each telling. Details shift, events get compressed or expanded. The story of something that happened over several years might be remembered as a single dramatic event, but the core truth often remained intact, enough to pass on crucial knowledge about flood patterns, hunting grounds, plant locations, and enemy movements. Some cultures developed more elaborate memory systems. The Inca used quipu, knotted strings in different colours, to record numerical information and possibly historical events. Different types of knots meant different things. The position of knots on the string carried meaning. It was a three-dimensional way of storing information, a calendar and a counting system all in one. Australian Aboriginal cultures used the landscape itself as a memory aid. Particular rocks, trees, waterholes and landforms were associated with specific stories. Walking through the landscape was like reading a book, each feature triggering the next part of the narrative. This created a spatial calendar, a way of organising time and events in relationship to place. You didn't need to remember everything, of course. You just needed to remember enough to function, enough to pass on essential knowledge, and enough to maintain continuity with the past. And you did this through repetition, through stories told over and over, and through seasonal activities that reinforced themselves year after year. The harvest happened every year, and you remembered how to do it because you'd done it many times before. The sacred ceremonies happened at regular intervals, and you remembered them through participation. The skills you needed to survive were encoded in muscle memory and habit, in knowledge passed down so smoothly you barely noticed you were learning it. Time wasn't something external to you that you had to track with tools. Time was the medium you lived in, and memory was how you navigated it. You're lying on your back in the darkness, looking up at more stars than anyone in the modern world can imagine seeing. There are no city lights to wash them out, no street lamps, and no illuminated signs. When the moon is down and the sky is clear, the stars are so dense they look like spilled milk, like someone scattered diamonds across black cloth. You know these stars. You've been watching them your whole life, and people have been watching them for thousands of years before you were born. You know their patterns, their movements, and their meanings. That bright cluster there, the one that looks like a tiny dipper or a small gathering of jewels. Different cultures called it different things, but you know it. The Greeks would call it the Pleiades. Other cultures called it the Seven Sisters. You might have a completely different name for it, but you know it matters because it appears at certain times of year and disappears at others. When those stars rise just before dawn, it might be time to plant. When they set with the sun, it might be time to harvest. When you can't see them at all, you're in a particular season, and you know what to expect from the weather and the world. The Egyptians watched Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. They called it Sopdet, and when it rose just before the sun after a period of invisibility, that meant the Nile was about to flood. This happened with such regularity that they based their entire calendar on it. The rising of Sirius marked the new year, the moment when everything reset. Different stars mattered to different people depending on where they lived and what they needed to know. If you were a sailor or a nomad crossing empty landscapes, stars were your navigation system. Certain stars stayed in the same place, or seemed to. The North Star in the Northern Hemisphere, barely moving while everything else wheeled around it, was a fixed point you could orient yourself by. You learned constellations not as arbitrary dot-to-dot pictures, but as memory aids, as ways to organise the chaos of the night sky into memorable patterns. That group of stars looks like a hunter. That one looks like a bear. That one looks like a water jar. The actual shapes didn't matter as much as the fact that they were recognisable, that you could point them out to your children and say, "Remember that pattern. It will tell you when to expect the rains." Some cultures saw the same constellations differently, which makes sense because the actual positions of stars don't inherently look like anything. They're just points of light. But humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and we'll find patterns in anything if we stare at it long enough. The moon was its own kind of calendar, more immediate than the slow wheeling of stars. You could watch the moon change every night, waxing from a thin crescent to a full circle, then waning back down to nothing. This cycle took about 29.5 days, and it was obvious and impossible to miss. Many early calendars were lunar calendars, organised around moon phases. A month was one full cycle of the moon. 12 months was roughly a year, though not quite. 12 lunar months add up to about 354 days, which is 11 days short of a solar year. This mismatch created problems that various cultures solved in various ways, mostly by adding extra months periodically to sync things back up. But the moon was useful for more than just marking months. It lit up the night during its full phase, which meant you could do things after dark that would otherwise be impossible. You could travel, you could hunt, you could hold ceremonies. The full moon was bright enough to see by, and communities planned around it. The dark of the moon was different. Those nights were truly dark, and people mostly stayed put unless they had torches or really good night vision. The dark of the moon was considered significant in many cultures, a time of quiet, of rest, of things hidden, of potential. You noticed that the moon rose at different times depending on its phase. A full moon rose right around sunset, hanging low and huge on the horizon before climbing into the sky. A crescent moon might appear just after sunset, thin and delicate, setting soon after. These patterns were predictable, and once you learned them, you could use them. The planets added another layer of complexity. They moved differently than stars, wandering across the sky in paths that took months or years to complete. Ancient people noticed this and tracked it, though they didn't know what planets were. They were just special stars that moved in meaningful ways. Some cultures believed the planets were gods, or represented gods, and that their movements influenced events on Earth. This led to astrology, the idea that celestial movements could predict or influence human affairs. Whether or not you believed in astrology, the fact remained that planets were good timekeepers. Mars makes a complete circuit of the sky every 2 years or so. Jupiter takes 12 years. Saturn takes about 30. If you were keeping track, you could use these cycles as long-term calendars, as ways to mark the passage of decades rather than days. And then there were meteor showers, comets, and eclipses. All the dramatic sky events that happened rarely enough to be memorable, but regularly enough to become part of the cosmic calendar. A total solar eclipse was terrifying if you didn't know it was coming, and amazing if you did. The sun disappearing in the middle of the day, darkness falling, stars becoming visible, then light gradually returning. This was the kind of event that got remembered, that got woven into myths and histories. You didn't need to understand the astronomy behind any of this. You just needed to watch, to remember, to connect what you saw in the sky with what happened on the ground. The sky was a clock, a calendar, and a story all at once. You know the festival is coming because everyone's acting different. There's a buzz in the air and anticipation. People are cleaning things that don't normally get cleaned, making special foods, and talking about who's going to do what and where they're going to stand. Children are excited in a way that makes them impossible to manage. The festival happens at the same time every year, or as close to the same time as you can manage without a standardized calendar. Maybe it's tied to the summer solstice, or the harvest moon, or the anniversary of some mythical event that happened so long ago. Nobody can quite remember when, but everyone agrees it's important. These sacred days were how ancient people organised time on a larger scale than daily or even seasonal rhythms. They were fixed points, moments when the whole community came together, when normal work stopped, and when you reconnected with the patterns that gave life meaning. Every culture had them. Days to honour gods or ancestors, days to celebrate successful harvests, days to mark the turning of seasons, days to initiate young people into adulthood, days to renew marriages or alliances, and days to ask forgiveness or make amends. These days were often determined by natural phenomena. The spring equinox was a popular time for festivals celebrating rebirth and renewal. The winter solstice called for festivals about the return of light. Full moons were good for ceremonies because you could see what you were doing. The Jewish calendar had, and has, a Sabbath every 7 days, a rhythm so regular and so ancient that it created its own temporal structure. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. This pattern repeated endlessly, independent of seasons or moon phases, creating a week-long cycle that many cultures eventually adopted in various forms. Other cultures had market days that served a similar function, every 8th day or every 10th day, or whatever interval made sense. People would gather to trade goods, exchange news, socialise and settle disputes. These market days became temporal landmarks. You'd plan things around them. "I'll see you at the next market" meant something specific and predictable. Religious observances created annual cycles. In ancient Greece, the Olympic Games happened every 4 years, bringing together people from different city-states. This was a form of timekeeping. Years were measured in Olympiads. In medieval Europe, saints' days dotted the calendar, each one commemorating a particular holy person, and often associated with specific activities or foods. Harvest festivals were nearly universal. When the crops came in, you celebrated. You thanked whatever gods or spirits you believed controlled fertility and weather. You ate well because you finally had food in abundance. You drank if you had anything to drink. You danced. You told stories. You courted. You strengthened social bonds that would help everyone survive the winter ahead. These festivals weren't just fun, though they were often fun. They were practical. They distributed resources. Everyone got fed at a feast. They reinforced social structures. Leaders led ceremonies, and followers followed. They passed on cultural knowledge through ritual and story. They gave people a break from the grinding work of survival, and they marked time in a way that was communal and participatory. You remembered the year as the year it rained during the harvest festival, or the year your cousin got married at the spring gathering. The festivals were memorable by design, full of special foods and unusual activities and emotional intensity. Some cultures built monuments to mark these sacred times. Stone circles aligned with solstices, pyramids that caught the sun at particular angles on particular days, buildings with windows positioned so that light would strike a specific spot once a year. These were calendars made of solid, permanent reminders of the moments that mattered. You didn't need to understand the astronomical calculations behind these alignments. You just needed to know that when the sun hit the marker, it was time for the ceremony. When the shadow fell in the right place, the new year began. The sacred calendar overlapped with the agricultural calendar, which made sense because survival depended on doing farming tasks at the right time, and the gods, or spirits, who controlled weather and fertility were worth placating. Planting ceremonies asked for good growth. Harvest ceremonies gave thanks for abundance. Ceremonies during dry seasons begged for rain. Not all sacred days were happy. Some commemorated disasters, defeats, and deaths. These were important too. They reminded the community of hard times survived, of ancestors honoured, and of vigilance needed. They created continuity with the past, a sense that the present moment was part of a longer story. All of this happened without anyone needing to know the numerical date. The festival came when it came, announced by the position of the sun or the phase of the moon, or the blooming of a particular plant. You prepared when the signs appeared. You participated when the moment arrived. You remembered it afterward, and that memory became part of the temporal framework of your life. Someone, somewhere, got tired of approximate timing. Maybe they were organising a large project that required coordination. Maybe they were running a temple with elaborate rituals that needed to happen at specific moments. Maybe they were just naturally inclined toward precision and wanted to know exactly how much daylight was left before sunset. So they invented the gnomon, which is a fancy word for stick in the ground that casts a shadow. This wasn't revolutionary technology. It was a stick, but it was a stick used intentionally, positioned carefully, with marks made to track where the shadow fell at different times. The Egyptians took this basic idea and ran with it. They created obelisks, tall stone pillars that cast long shadows. They divided the daylight into 12 parts, possibly because they had a thing for the number 12, or possibly because 10 fingers plus 2 more seemed like a good way to subdivide things. These weren't hours as we know them. They were temporal hours, which meant they changed length depending on the season. A daytime hour in summer was longer than a daytime hour in winter, because there were more daylight hours to divide up. This seems weird now, but it made sense then. Nighttime was divided into 12 parts too, and those night hours also changed length with the seasons. The problem with sundials, and any shadow-based timekeeping, is that they don't work when it's cloudy, and they definitely don't work at night. So people invented water clocks, devices that measured time by the steady flow of water from one container to another. The Egyptians had water clocks in temples, elaborate stone vessels with marks inside showing how many hours had passed based on the water level. These weren't perfectly accurate, but they were better than nothing when the sun wasn't cooperating. Other cultures developed their own versions. The Greeks made fancy water clocks with gears and moving figures. The Chinese created incense clocks that measured time by how long it took for fragrant materials to burn. These worked at night and didn't depend on weather, though you had to make sure nobody accidentally blew out your timekeeping flame. Candle clocks worked on a similar principle. Mark a candle at regular intervals, light it, and watch it burn down. When the flame reaches the next mark, a certain amount of time has passed. The accuracy depended on the candle burning evenly, which wasn't always guaranteed, but it gave you a general sense of how much night had elapsed. None of these devices could measure minutes or seconds. Those units didn't exist yet in any practical sense, and even when they were theoretically defined, no clock was accurate enough to track them. Time was still measured in relatively large chunks, hours at best, more often in quarters of the day or watches of the night. Sailors developed their own timing methods because they needed to know how long they'd been travelling and in which direction. They used the stars for direction and rough time estimates. They used their bodies, how tired they were, how hungry, how much sleep they'd had. They watched the sun and moon like everyone else, but the ocean presented special challenges. You couldn't plant a stick in the water. You had nothing stable to cast a shadow on, so sailors became experts at reading the sky and estimating time by the positions of celestial bodies, by the colour of the water, and by the behaviour of seabirds and fish. Hourglasses appeared eventually, sand trickling from one glass bulb to another through a narrow neck. These were portable and didn't depend on water that might freeze or evaporate. You could use them on ships, in monasteries, or anywhere you needed to track a specific interval of time. When the sand ran out, you flipped the glass and started again. But all of these devices were still tied to natural rhythms in one way or another. Water flows because of gravity, which is a constant. Candles burn because of combustion, which is chemical. Sand falls because of gravity again. These were attempts to measure time using processes that happened at predictable rates, but they were still approximate, still subject to variations in temperature and humidity and construction quality. The real obsession with precision came much later, when mechanical clocks were invented, and when navigation required knowing the exact time to calculate longitude. But even in the ancient world, there was a growing desire to pin time down, to make it measurable and divisible, and to create units that everyone could agree on. This was partly practical and partly philosophical. If you could measure time precisely, You could schedule things, coordinate activities, and synchronize actions across distances. You could say, meet me when 3 hours have passed instead of meet me when the sun is about there. But there was something else too, something almost defiant in the attempt to mark and measure something as fluid as time. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. You could do it for a moment, but it always slipped away. Here's the thing about living without clocks. You were almost never late. You couldn't be late to something that didn't have a specific start time. You showed up when you showed up, and things began when enough people had gathered, and nobody was checking their wrist wondering where you were. This drove later civilizations crazy. Roman historians complained about Germanic tribes who had no concept of punctuality, who would agree to meet when the sun was high, and then show up anywhere within a several-hour window. The Romans had divided their days into hours, and wanted everyone else to do the same, and they couldn't understand why people wouldn't simply comply with such an obviously superior system. But for most of human history, time was loose. It had to be. You couldn't control it precisely, so you worked with it instead of against it. You did things when conditions were right, not when the clock said to. If you were baking bread, you didn't set a timer. You watched the bread, you smelled it, you touched the crust, you pulled it from the oven when it was done, which might be sooner or later than expected depending on the fire temperature, the humidity, and the exact composition of the dough. If you were meeting someone for a journey, you agreed to leave at dawn, or after the midday meal, or when the moon rises. Then you both showed up at roughly those times, and if one person was a bit earlier or later, well, that's what happened. Nobody was tracking minutes. Work expanded to fill the available time or contracted, depending on urgency and energy. During planting season or harvest, you worked until the job was done or until you physically couldn't continue. During winter, you worked enough to stay busy, but not so much that you exhausted yourself when food was scarce. There was no 9 to 5. There was dawn to dusk if you were farming, or whenever the work needs doing if you were a craftsperson, or irregular hours based on supply and demand if you were a merchant. Children grew up in this temporal fluidity, and they learned to navigate it without stress. They understood that some days were work days and some days weren't. They understood that some times of year required maximum effort and sometimes allowed for rest. They didn't expect every day to look the same, because days didn't look the same. This flexible relationship with time meant you paid attention to what was actually happening rather than what was supposed to be happening. You noticed when someone was tired and needed rest, when animals were behaving strangely, when weather was changing, and when your own body was telling you something. Modern people sometimes romanticize this and imagine it was all peaceful and unstressed, which isn't quite accurate. Ancient people had plenty of stress, just not about being 3 minutes late to a meeting. They worried about whether the rains would come, whether there would be enough food, and whether invaders or wild animals or disease would destroy everything they'd built. But they didn't worry about wasted time in the modern sense. Time couldn't be wasted because it wasn't a commodity you possessed. It was the medium you existed in, and it flowed whether you were productive or not. This started to change when societies became more complex, when you needed to coordinate large groups of people, when trade required agreements about when goods would be delivered, and when religious ceremonies needed priests and participants to show up at the same moment. Monasteries were some of the first places to insist on precise timing. Monks were supposed to pray at specific hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Someone had to ring the bells to announce these hours, and that someone had to be paying attention to the sky, or to a water clock, or to some other timing device. This monastic schedule eventually influenced the wider world. People who lived near monasteries could hear the bells and organise their own activities around them. "I'll meet you at the next bell" became a way to synchronise. But for most people in most places for most of history, time remained flexible and forgiving, and tied to natural cycles rather than arbitrary divisions. You didn't beat yourself up for not being productive every minute. You didn't feel guilty about rest. You didn't rush through experiences to get to the next thing on the schedule. You just lived, and time passed, and you noticed its passing through the changing light and the growing children and the accumulating memories. Something happened when we started dividing time into smaller and smaller units, when we invented clocks accurate enough to track seconds and eventually milliseconds. We gained the ability to coordinate across distances, to run complex systems, and to be exactly where we said we'd be at exactly the time we promised. But we lost something too. We lost the deep connection to natural rhythms, the awareness of our own bodily cycles, and the flexibility to respond to what's actually happening rather than what's scheduled to happen. Modern people look at their phones dozens of times a day to check the time, as if time might have changed its speed when they weren't looking. Ancient people looked at the sky, at their shadows, and at the world around them, and they knew what time it was in a way that mattered for their lives. They knew it was time to eat because they were hungry and the food was ready. They knew it was time to sleep because darkness had fallen and their bodies were tired. They knew it was time to plant because the soil had warmed and the rains were coming. They knew it was time to gather because the berries were ripe and wouldn't stay that way for long. This knowledge was practical and embodied. It wasn't abstract. You didn't need to translate natural phenomena into numbers and then translate the numbers back into action. You just acted based on what you observed and felt. Some of this knowledge is still accessible if you pay attention. You can still watch the sun move across the sky, notice the changing length of days, and feel the seasons shift. You can still observe the moon's phases, learn the constellations, and recognize the temporal rhythms in your own body. But it requires deliberately stepping back from the constructed time of schedules and alarms and appointments, and that's hard to do in a world that runs on those things. Ancient people didn't have to try to be present in the moment because there was nowhere else to be. They didn't have to practice mindfulness because their survival depended on paying attention. They didn't need apps to remind them to notice nature because nature was the dominant reality of their existence. They also couldn't escape time. They couldn't distract themselves endlessly with entertainment. When night fell, and unless you had fire or moonlight, you sat in darkness. When winter came, and you endured it. When someone died, you couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Time carried you forward whether you were ready or not. In some ways, the invention of precise timekeeping was an attempt to gain control over something fundamentally uncontrollable. We can measure time down to the nanosecond, but we can't slow it down or speed it up or get back the moments we've lost. We can schedule every minute of our days, but we can't make ourselves immune to aging, illness, or death. Ancient people knew this. They built monuments that would outlast them, told stories that would be remembered after they were gone, and participated in cycles that would continue long after any individual life ended. They accepted their own temporariness while connecting to something larger and more enduring. The sun still rises and sets on the same schedule it always has. The moon still waxes and wanes. The seasons still turn. The earth still rotates. All the fundamental timekeeping mechanisms that ancient people relied on are still functioning, exactly as they did thousands of years ago. We've just stopped watching. You're lying in bed now, in a room that ancient people would find almost unimaginably strange. The light that lets you see these words comes from electricity, not fire. The temperature is controlled by systems those people couldn't have conceived of. The very concept of reading silently to yourself before sleep would puzzle them. Reading was usually a communal activity, done aloud, and books were rare enough that most people never saw one. But your body is doing exactly what bodies have always done at the end of the day. Your temperature is dropping slightly. Your brain is starting to produce the chemicals that will pull you into sleep. Your breathing is slowing. Your muscles are relaxing. You're tired because you've been awake for enough hours, because you've used enough energy, and because your circadian rhythms are telling you it's time to shut down for maintenance and repair. This is the same tiredness humans have felt for hundreds of thousands of years. The moon is out there somewhere, waxing or waning, pulling the tides, cycling through its phases. The sun will rise tomorrow at a time you could calculate if you knew your latitude and the date, and ancient people could predict without knowing either of those things in numerical terms. The stars are wheeling overhead, though you can't see them through the city lights. The earth is turning at the same speed it's always turned. The seasons are shifting according to the same patterns that governed harvest and planting for every agricultural society that ever existed. You don't need to watch these things to participate in them. You're participating just by existing, by living in a body that's still fundamentally the same kind of body humans have always had, and by occupying a planet that's still following the same orbital mechanics. Ancient people would probably be amazed by what we can do with time now, how we can coordinate actions across continents, how we can measure intervals too small to perceive, how we can record moments and play them back, and how we can seem to compress time through rapid travel or expand it through entertainment. But they might also feel a little sorry for us, constantly rushing, constantly checking, and constantly worried about being late or wasting time or not doing enough. They might suggest we look up more often, notice the sky, feel the seasons, and trust our bodies. They lived entire lives without ever knowing what time it was in the way we think of knowing the time, and they did just fine. They built civilizations, created art, fell in love, raised children, told stories, and explored the world. They did all of this while stealing time from shadows and stars and the growling of their own stomachs. Maybe tomorrow you could try their way for a little while. Wake without an alarm if possible. Let your body tell you when it's rested. Eat when you're hungry rather than when it's time to eat. Notice the sun's position, the shadow you cast, and the quality of light at different times of day. You won't be able to live entirely that way. Modern life requires schedules. But you can remember that underneath all the constructed time, the measured time and the scheduled time, there's still natural time flowing along as it always has. And natural time says it's late now, that you've been awake long enough, and that your body needs rest. Natural time says to stop thinking, stop planning, and stop worrying about tomorrow. Natural time says to close your eyes and let the darkness take you, to trust that the sun will rise without you watching for it. That morning will come whether you're anxious about it or not. The ancient people would approve of that. They'd tell you to sleep, to let time carry you through the night, to wake when you wake, and to begin again. So sleep now. The world will keep turning. Time will keep passing, and you'll still be part of it all, just as humans have always been, since long before anyone thought to count the hours. You're settling in to discover a world that vanished beneath waves so gradually that no single generation noticed the transformation. Tonight's journey takes you back approximately 20,000 years to the Persian Gulf, a place that wasn't a gulf at all, but a verdant river valley where some of humanity's earliest communities built lives along waterways that no longer exist. Close your eyes and prepare to walk through settlements that drowned one careful step at a time, leaving behind only whispers and flood myths and fragments beneath the modern seafloor. The land stretches before you in the half-light of dawn, 15,000 years before anyone will call this place the Persian Gulf. You're standing in a river valley so vast that you can't see the opposite ridge, even on the clearest morning. The air tastes different here than it will in the future, drier, carrying dust from exposed seabeds that your distant descendants will only know as underwater landscapes. Two rivers converge somewhere to your north, the ancient predecessors of the Tigris and Euphrates, but they're broader here, lazier, carving through sediment that will one day rest 300 feet beneath salt water. Your feet press into soil that has never known the sea. Small acacias dot the landscape, their roots reaching down into groundwater that flows in predictable patterns. You notice how the vegetation follows invisible lines across the valley floor, marking ancient watercourses that shift with the seasons but always return to their favoured channels. A herd of onager, wild relatives of donkeys, moves across the middle distance, their dust trail catching the morning light in a way that makes them look like they're walking through liquid gold. Someone millennia from now will dredge up their bones from what they'll call the sea floor, puzzling over how land animals ended up in marine sediment, never quite believing the obvious answer. This wasn't always water. The temperature drops noticeably as you walk into the shadow of an escarpment. These rock faces will become dive sites for recreational scuba enthusiasts, but right now they're just wind-carved sandstone streaked with mineral deposits that paint abstract patterns across their surfaces. You run your hand along the stone and feel how the wind has polished certain sections to an almost glassy smoothness. Small lizards scatter at your approach, their bodies perfectly adapted to conserving water in an environment that receives perhaps 6 inches of rain in a good year. You're moving toward a cluster of structures that barely qualify as buildings. They're more like windbreaks with delusions of grandeur, circles of stacked stone about waist high, with roofs made from whatever materials were handy. Brush, mostly, with some animal hide stretched across wooden frames that someone probably dragged from the river valley's upper reaches. Smoke rises from several of these dwellings, not in dramatic plumes but in apologetic wisps, as if the fires themselves aren't quite convinced they're worth the effort. A woman emerges from one structure carrying a basket woven from river reeds. She's wearing what you generously call clothing, mostly animal hides worked soft through a process you don't want to think about too carefully while trying to fall asleep. Her hands move with practiced efficiency as she sorts through small shells, separating them by size into different piles. These aren't seashells, despite how that sounds. They're freshwater mollusks from the river, and she's probably preparing them for either food or trade. You notice she keeps glancing toward the eastern horizon, where the sky is brightening in shades that don't have names yet. The settlement, you hesitate to call it a village, contains perhaps 20 of these structures arranged in no particular pattern that you can discern. People move between them with the unhurried pace of individuals who understand that rushing accomplishes nothing in a landscape this size. A man works at chipping stone tools near the largest dwelling, the rhythmic tapping of his hammerstone providing an oddly soothing percussion to the morning. The flakes that spiral away from his work will eventually become part of the archaeological record. Tiny time capsules that will utterly confuse marine geologists who expect only ocean-borne sediments at these depths. You walk past what might be the community's proudest achievement, a stone-lined well that extends down about 15 feet. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to shore up the walls with carefully selected rocks, creating a structure that should last generations. It will, in fact, last considerably longer than that, though it will spend most of that time underwater, slowly filling with marine sediment until archaeologists in the 21st century will spend months arguing about whether it's a natural feature or human-made. The water level inside sits about 8 feet down, and you can see where people have worn smooth grooves in the stone from centuries of rope work, hauling up container after container of water that tastes faintly metallic, but is otherwise perfectly drinkable. Children play near the well, engaged in a game that seems to involve throwing pebbles at a target scratched into the dirt. They're loud in the way children everywhere are loud, their voices carrying across the settlement with complete disregard for anyone trying to sleep late. One of them, a girl perhaps 7 or 8 years old, has developed an impressive throwing technique, releasing each stone with a little flick of her wrist that sends it spinning through the air with unusual accuracy. You suspect she'll grow up to be excellent at hunting small game, assuming she survives the various hazards that make childhood in this era a rather uncertain proposition. The river itself runs about 2 miles from here, though its exact distance changes with the seasons. Right now, in what passes for spring in this climate, it's swollen with runoff from mountains so distant, they're more concept than reality to the people living here. You make your way toward it, following a well-worn path that generations of feet have pressed into the hardpan. The vegetation thickens as you approach the water, not dramatically, but enough that you notice the transition from sparse scrubland to something approaching actual greenery. Tamarisk trees cluster near the riverbank, their feathery branches creating patches of shade that feel like luxury in this sun-hammered landscape. You spot evidence of beaver activity, not the same species that will later inhabit North American streams, but a related creature with similar engineering ambitions. They've constructed a dam that's redirecting perhaps a third of the river's flow into a side channel, creating a quieter pool where fish congregate in numbers that must seem like providence to anyone with a spear and patience. A woman stands in the shallows, her approach to fishing best described as optimistic. She holds a woven basket submerged to just below the waterline, waiting with the stillness of someone who's done this so many times that her body has memorized the exact posture required. You watch as a fish, something that looks vaguely carp-like, swims obligingly into her trap. She lifts the basket with a smooth motion that sends water cascading through the weave, leaving the fish flopping indignantly inside. She doesn't celebrate or even really acknowledge the catch, just transfers the fish to a larger container and resumes her vigil. This is dinner, or part of it, but it's also just Tuesday, or whatever these people call the third day after the moon does that thing where it looks like someone bit into it. The river itself is nothing like the narrow channelized waterways that will eventually feed into the Persian Gulf. It's perhaps 300 yards across at this point, though during the dry season it probably shrinks to half that. The water runs brown with suspended sediment, carrying the mountain's business down toward the valley floor in a process that has continued since water first found this particular path to follow. Small islands have formed in the middle channel where debris has collected over the years, mostly dead trees and accumulated brush, but also the occasional boulder that some long ago flood carried from upstream. You notice how the settlement's inhabitants have positioned themselves in relation to water. They're close enough to access it easily, but far enough back that even exceptional flooding wouldn't reach their dwellings. This isn't luck or accident. These people, or their ancestors, have watched the river long enough to understand its moods, its maximums, and its behaviour during those rare years when winter storms pile up against the distant mountains and send walls of water churning through the valley. They've built their lives in the safe zone, that perfect distance where convenience meets prudence. As you walk back toward the settlement, you spot something that makes you pause. Carved into a flat section of rock, someone has scratched a series of marks. They're not writing, not quite, but they're not random either. They appear to track something, perhaps lunar cycles, perhaps seasonal changes, perhaps just one person's attempt to impose order on time's relentless forward motion. You count 27 distinct marks before the pattern seems to repeat, which might indicate moon phases or might mean absolutely nothing. Future archaeologists will discover this rock face beneath 50 feet of seawater and will write 3 separate papers arguing about its significance, which seems both appropriate and faintly ridiculous. The sun has fully cleared the horizon now, and the temperature is already climbing toward uncomfortable. People move a bit faster, trying to accomplish tasks before the real heat arrives. A group of men prepares for what looks like a hunting expedition, checking stone-tipped spears and gathering supplies into leather pouches that have been worked soft through processes involving urine and brains that you're grateful you don't have to witness. They'll be gone for days, possibly weeks, following the game into the higher elevations where the temperature stays bearable even in summer. You notice an older woman sitting in the shade of her dwelling, working on what appears to be a hide. She's using a scraping tool made from sharpened bone, removing the last bits of fat and tissue with motions so practiced they're nearly meditative. Her hands are weathered beyond anything you've seen in your own time, marked by decades of work that didn't include moisturizer or ergonomic tool design. She glances up as you pass, and her eyes hold a kind of accumulated knowledge that makes you wonder what story she could tell if you shared language. She's seen perhaps 50 summers, which makes her ancient by the standards of her community, a repository of information about weather patterns and plant cycles, and where to find water when the obvious sources fail. The settlement contains no monumental architecture, no temples or palaces, or anything that future civilizations would recognize as impressive. These are people living close to subsistence, their entire material culture designed around the basic questions of water, food, and shelter. And yet there's a sophistication here that's easy to miss if you're expecting pyramids. The well represents an enormous investment of labour. The basket weaving shows mathematical understanding of pattern and structure. The careful positioning of dwellings reveals generational knowledge about flood patterns and prevailing winds. You find a spot in the shade and sit, watching the morning unfold with a slowness that feels almost defiant in its refusal to hurry. A dog, or something dog-adjacent, probably several generations removed from wolves but not yet fully committed to domestication, wanders past, tongue lolling in the heat. It pauses to sniff your feet with the suspicious thoroughness of an animal that takes border security seriously, then apparently decides you're neither threatening nor interesting enough to warrant further investigation. The landscape around you is changing, though no one here will live long enough to notice. The climate is shifting gradually as the great ice sheets that covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere continue their slow retreat. More water is returning to the oceans. Sea levels are rising, though not in the dramatic day-after-tomorrow fashion that makes for exciting storytelling. Instead, they're climbing at a rate measured in inches per century, so slowly that 100 generations might live and die without anyone remarking on the change. But the water is coming. Somewhere to the south, beyond what is currently a 1,000-mile-long valley, the Indian Ocean is pressing against the narrow strait that will eventually become the Strait of Hormuz. Not yet, though. Not for thousands of years yet. Right now, that southern end of the valley is still dry land, still home to its own settlements and river systems, and people who have no idea they're living in what will become a shipping lane. You stand and stretch, feeling the heat on your skin, breathing air that hasn't been altered by industrial processes or fossil fuel combustion. The sky overhead is a blue so intense it almost hurts to look at, unmarked by contrails or pollution, or any evidence of the civilization that will eventually claim this region. A hawk circles high above, riding thermals with the casual mastery of a creature that has evolved for exactly this environment. You wonder if its descendants will adapt to coastal life when the water arrives, or if they'll simply move inland, following the familiar landscapes as they retreat before the advancing sea. The woman with the shell basket has finished her sorting and is now stringing the largest specimens onto a cord made from twisted plant fibre. These will become currency of a sort, traded with other settlements for obsidian or good flint or whatever commodities you can't produce yourself when your entire economy runs on barter and interpersonal relationships. She works with the focused attention of someone performing a task that matters, even though to outside eyes it might seem like she's just playing with shells. A commotion near the well draws your attention. Two children are arguing about something with the passionate intensity that children bring to disputes that adults can't even comprehend as worthy of conflict. An older boy intervenes, settling the matter with what appears to be a combination of logic and the threat of telling someone's mother. The defeated child, you can't tell if it's a boy or girl from this distance, stalks off with wounded dignity, while the victor returns to the pebble-throwing game with the satisfaction of someone who has defended an important principle. The settlement's rhythms are becoming clearer to you now. Morning is for water hauling and tool-making and preparing for the day's necessary labours. Afternoon will drive everyone into whatever shade they can find, a forced siesta dictated by temperatures that make physical exertion genuinely dangerous. Evening will bring renewed activity, cooler air, and whatever social interactions pass for entertainment in a world without screens or books or anything except other people and the landscape's subtle dramas. You realise you're watching the beginnings of civilization, not the version with writing and cities and centralised government, but the deeper foundation. These people are solving the same basic problems that every human community must solve: how to get food, how to stay safe, how to pass knowledge to the next generation, and how to maintain social bonds that make cooperation possible. They're doing it with stone tools and oral traditions, and an intimate knowledge of their environment that will be completely lost once the water covers everything. The river continues its patient work of carrying sediment toward the valley floor, building up layers that will eventually compress into rock, creating a geological record that future scientists will read like a book. Each flood leaves its signature in the sediment. Each dry season etches itself in the patterns of cracked mud. The story is being written in real time, though no one here can read it. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of the settlement. The rhythmic tapping of stone tool manufacture, the occasional laugh or shout from children playing, the rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation, the distant murmur of the river. These are the sounds of a world that's already disappearing, though it will take millennia for the transformation to complete itself. The water is coming, patient and inexorable, and these people's descendants will gradually adjust, moving their settlements, adapting their lives, and creating flood myths to explain why the world keeps getting smaller. You're walking upstream now, following the river into territory that fewer people frequent. The landscape here looks surprisingly similar to what you left behind. The same hardy vegetation, the same sun-blasted rocks, the same sense that water is the exception rather than the rule. But the river itself is different, younger somehow, less burdened by sediment. You can actually see the bottom in the shallower sections, where stones polished by centuries of current gleam like they've been lacquered. The river-valley system you're exploring isn't a single waterway but a network, a complex web of channels that braid and separate and rejoin, according to seasonal rhythms and the landscape's subtle topography. Some of these channels flow year-round, fed by springs and groundwater that surfaces through cracks in the underlying rock. Others are seasonal affairs, dry gullies for most of the year that transform into raging torrents when winter rains finally arrive. The people who live here know each channel intimately, know which ones are reliable and which ones are treacherous, and know where to find water even when the surface flow disappears. You encounter evidence of human activity about every mile or so. Not settlements exactly, but stopping points. Places where travellers have paused long enough to leave traces. Fire rings circled with stones. Scatters of worked flint where someone sat and manufactured tools while waiting out the heat of the day. Occasional caches of preserved food tucked into rock overhangs, marked with signs that probably mean this belongs to someone who will be very annoyed if you eat it. The valley functions as a highway, a trade route, and a lifeline connecting communities that might be separated by dozens or even hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. A natural spring emerges from the base of a limestone cliff, creating a small oasis that's almost shockingly green against the surrounding browns and tans. Date palms cluster here, their presence suggesting either incredible luck or human intervention at some point in the past. You suspect the latter. Someone probably carried seeds or young plants from another location, planting them here because they understood that reliable water plus edible fruit equals a strategic resource worth protecting. The spring itself produces perhaps 5 gallons per minute, forming a small pool before the overflow continues downslope to join the main river. The water is cool enough to make your teeth ache when you cup some in your hands and drink. It tastes slightly sweet, the product of limestone filtration, nothing like the muddy river water you sampled earlier. Small fish dart through the pool, minnows or something similar, their presence indicating that this spring has been flowing for long enough to develop its own ecosystem. Someone has arranged flat stones around the pool's edge, creating a more defined basin that prevents erosion and keeps the water clearer. It's maintenance that requires occasional renewal, suggesting this spot sees regular use despite its distance from permanent settlements. You imagine traders stopping here, grateful for water that doesn't need to be boiled or strained, exchanging news with whoever else happens to be passing through. It's a natural meeting point, the kind of location that accumulates stories and significance beyond its physical attributes. As you continue upstream, the river narrows and the current strengthens. You're entering the foothills now, where the valley floor gives way to broken terrain that's considerably harder to traverse. The vegetation changes too, becoming slightly denser, incorporating species that need more water than the valley floor can provide. You spot wild grapes clinging to a rocky outcrop, their presence suggesting that sometime in the next few months, this area will attract people willing to make the difficult journey for the chance to harvest fruit that doesn't require cultivation. The river has carved a small gorge through this section, creating rock walls perhaps 30 feet high on either side. The stone shows clear stratification, layers of sediment compressed over unimaginable spans of time, each band representing a different climate, a different world. You run your hand along the rock face and feel fossils beneath your fingers, the preserved remains of creatures that lived when this entire region rested beneath a shallow sea millions of years earlier. It's a reminder that the coming flood won't be the first time water has claimed this landscape, just the most recent. A cairn stands on a rocky promontory overlooking the gorge, stones stacked with deliberate care to create a marker visible from a considerable distance. These waypoints guide travellers through terrain that can be confusing even for people who know it well. This particular cairn might mark a good ford or a dangerous section to avoid, or simply serve as a counting point for tracking distance travelled. You notice that someone has recently added a fresh stone to the top, continuing a tradition that might stretch back centuries. The sound of the river echoes off the gorge walls, creating an acoustic environment that's almost musical. Different flow rates produce different tones, and you suspect someone familiar with this section could judge water levels by sound alone. During flood season, this gorge probably becomes impassable, a churning chaos of white water that would kill anyone foolish enough to attempt crossing. But right now it's peaceful, almost contemplative, the water moving with purpose but not urgency. You spot a family group working their way downstream along the opposite bank. They're carrying bundles that suggest they've been gathering something. Plant materials maybe, or materials for tool making. 2 adults and 3 children, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who know this terrain well enough to traverse it without constant attention to foot placement. The children range in age from perhaps 4 to 10, and even the youngest navigates the rocky bank with surprising confidence. No one acknowledges your presence across the water. You're simply another person travelling through a landscape that belongs to everyone and no one. Higher still, where the river emerges from truly mountainous terrain, you find evidence of more intensive human activity. Someone has constructed a series of small diversion channels, routing water into shallow basins where useful plants grow in neat rows. It's not quite agriculture. The plants are species that grow wild in this region, but it's not quite gathering either. Call it encouraged production, a middle ground between pure hunting and gathering and full-scale farming. The basins contain wild barley and several species you don't recognise, their roots drinking from water that would otherwise rush past without benefit to anyone. An elderly man tends these plantings, moving along the channels with a stick that he uses to clear debris and maintain water flow. He's thin in the way that suggests a lifetime of physical labour rather than malnutrition, his skin weathered to leather by decades of sun exposure. He glances at you with the polite disinterest of someone who sees occasional strangers and has learned they're usually neither threat nor opportunity. You wonder if he created these channels or inherited them from someone else, whether he's been working this same plot for years or was recently displaced from somewhere else. The mountain peaks visible in the distance still carry snow, though it's melting fast as spring progresses. This runoff feeds the river system, creating the seasonal variation that people downstream plan their entire lives around. Too little snow and the summer will be brutal, with water sources drying up early, forcing difficult decisions about whether to stay or move. Too much snow and the spring floods become dangerous, potentially destroying years of accumulated infrastructure and supplies. You realise you're standing at what amounts to the headwaters of civilization in this region, not because of any inherent superiority of the location, but because water flows downhill and everything else flows from that basic fact. The communities downstream depend on what happens here, on the snow that falls and melts, on the springs that emerge from cracks in the rock, and on the complex hydrology that determines whether any given year will be one of plenty or privation. A thunderhead is building to the west, a towering column of clouds that promises afternoon rain. You watch it develop with the appreciation of someone who doesn't have to worry about whether their shelter will leak or their stored grain will get wet. The people here watch it differently, calculating whether the rain will bring benefit or damage, whether it signals the beginning of a larger weather pattern or stands alone. They're meteorologists without instruments, climate scientists working from observation, and accumulated knowledge rather than satellites and computer models. The old man working the channels has noticed the approaching storm too. He's moving faster now, securing things that might wash away, making sure his diversions are clear enough to handle increased flow without overtopping their banks. It's a dance he's probably performed hundreds of times, the choreography of someone who understands that nature provides both the resources and the challenges, often in the same package. You find shelter beneath an overhang as the first large drops begin to fall. The rain arrives with the enthusiasm of water that's been held in the sky too long, spattering against the rocks with sounds like someone throwing handfuls of gravel. The temperature drops noticeably, the air filling with the smell of wet dust, a scent that will later be analysed and explained and given the scientific name petrichor, but which right now is just the smell of rain doing rain things to dry ground. The river below begins to change colour almost immediately, the increased flow stirring up sediment that's been settled and patient. Within 20 minutes, the water has gone from brown to the kind of reddish-brown that suggests serious erosion happening somewhere upstream. Small channels that were dry minutes ago now carry enthusiastic streams, all of them finding their way to the main river with the inevitability of gravity. You watch the water rise, not dramatically but noticeably, gaining perhaps an inch in the half-hour you sit beneath the overhang. It's a small preview of the transformation this entire valley will undergo over the coming millennia, the gradual accumulation of water that will eventually turn a river valley into a seaway. Of course the mechanism will be different, rising seas rather than rainfall, and the timescale will be vastly longer, but the basic principle remains the same. Water goes where physics tells it to go, and everything else has to adapt or drown. The rain passes as quickly as it arrived, the storm cell moving eastward to drench someone else's landscape. The sun emerges, turning the wet rocks into a field of small mirrors, each surface reflecting light in a way that makes the entire landscape seem to shimmer. Steam rises from the hotter surfaces as water evaporates with the urgency of a liquid that knows it won't last long in this climate. The old man returns to his channels, checking for damage, clearing new debris deposited by the brief flood. He works without apparent frustration, treating this as just another task in a lifetime of tasks, necessary maintenance in a world that requires constant attention. You wonder what will happen to these carefully maintained diversions when he's gone, whether someone else will take over the work or if the channels will gradually fill with sediment and disappear, their existence eventually forgotten by everyone except archaeologists puzzling over geometric depressions beneath the seafloor. You're back in the valley floor now, but time has shifted forward several generations. The settlement you visited earlier has grown, or perhaps this is a different community altogether. It's genuinely difficult to tell when architecture consists of variations on the theme of stones arranged in circles. What's undeniable is that there are more people, more structures, and a sense of slightly greater permanence. Some dwellings now have stone walls that reach chest height, before giving way to organic roofing materials. Someone has invested effort in creating a communal space, a roughly circular clearing with fire-worn stones that suggest regular gatherings. The climate is changing, though asking anyone here about climate change would earn you the kind of blank stare reserved for nonsensical questions. As far as the inhabitants are concerned, weather varies from year to year in ways that have always varied, and always will vary. Some winters are wet, some are dry. Some summers are brutal, others are merely unpleasant. The river rises and falls according to patterns that generally make sense but occasionally surprise everyone. This is simply how the world works. What they don't notice, what they can't notice given the timescales involved, is that the average is shifting. The wettest years are slightly wetter than they used to be. The river's base flow is marginally higher. Springs that occasionally dried up now run year-round. The changes are subtle enough that no individual could detect them across their lifespan, but they're real, documented in the geological record that's accumulating beneath everyone's feet. An old woman sits near the communal fire pit, working on what appears to be a basket but might be a trap or a storage container, or any of a dozen other things that woven reeds can become in practiced hands. She's surrounded by children of various ages, and you realise you're witnessing a lesson. knowledge being transmitted from one generation to the next through the ancient technology of showing someone how to do something until they can do it themselves. The children's attention waxes and wanes in the way that children's attention always does, but the old woman doesn't seem bothered. She continues her demonstration, narrating in a language you can't understand but whose cadence suggests she's done this many times before. One girl, perhaps 9 years old, shows particular aptitude, her fingers mimicking the old woman's motions with increasing confidence. Another child, a boy of similar age, seems to be attending more out of social obligation than genuine interest, his eyes constantly drifting toward where older boys are practicing with throwing spears. You notice subtle evidence of technological progress scattered throughout the settlement. Someone has discovered that certain clays, when heated, become water resistant, and several crude ceramic vessels sit near one dwelling, representing an innovation that will revolutionize food storage and preparation. The pottery is rough, thick-walled, and barely fit for purpose, but it's pottery, and it represents a conceptual breakthrough that will ripple through this culture over the coming generations. A group of adults is engaged in what looks like community planning, though it's really just people standing around pointing at things and presumably arguing about what should happen next. They're focused on an area near the well, where someone wants to build something, you can't tell what, and others apparently have opinions about whether this is a good idea. It's democracy at its most basic, consensus building through discussion, and probably some level of social pressure that wouldn't translate well to modern sensibilities. The resolution appears to involve compromise, what a surprise, and work begins on what reveals itself to be an expanded water storage system. Several people start digging a shallow basin adjacent to the existing well, lining it with stones brought from the river. The labour is divided along lines that might be gender or age or simply who's good at what tasks. Some people dig, some people carry stones, and some people fit the stones together with a precision that suggests either natural talent or extensive practice. You watch this construction project with the knowledge that it's ultimately futile. Not in the immediate sense, this water storage will serve the community well for generations, but in the longer term. In a few thousand years, this entire settlement will rest beneath hundreds of feet of seawater, all this careful labour transformed into a geometric anomaly that will briefly confuse marine archaeologists before they move on to more interesting findings. But that knowledge doesn't make the work less meaningful to the people doing it. They're solving the problems in front of them with the tools they have available, building infrastructure that will serve their grandchildren even if it won't survive their great-great-great-grandchildren. That seems to be enough. A child brings you water in one of the new ceramic vessels, offering it with shy formality that suggests adults have been coaching appropriate behaviour around strangers. The water tastes slightly of clay, an earthy undertone that isn't unpleasant but definitely noticeable. You drink it gratefully, aware that the child is watching for your reaction with the intensity of someone who's been told this is an important responsibility. You smile and nod, and the child scampers off with the satisfaction of a task successfully completed. The afternoon heat is building, and activity throughout the settlement is winding down in response. People retreat into whatever shade they can find or create, settling into the drowsy stillness that hot climates impose on sensible people. A few dogs, they're definitely dogs now, not wolf-adjacent creatures of questionable allegiance, sprawl in patches of shade, panting heavily, too hot to even investigate interesting smells. You find your own shade beneath one of the tamarisk trees that someone has encouraged to grow near the settlement. From here, you can see the entire community, such as it is, spread out in what passes for an organised layout. There's a logic to the arrangement that becomes clearer the longer you study it. Dwellings cluster in family groups, with clear spaces between clusters that probably represent social boundaries as much as physical ones. The communal areas, the well, the fire pit, and the new water storage project, occupy central locations accessible to everyone. The river is visible in the middle distance, a brown ribbon cutting through the landscape. You can see where people have worn paths to the water, multiple routes suggesting different purposes or preferences. One path leads to where women typically do washing and water collection. another angle toward better fishing spots. A third approaches an easier ford that's probably used for crossing to the opposite bank. Clouds are building again, the same afternoon pattern you witnessed upstream. These storms seem to be becoming more frequent, or maybe you're just noticing them more. Either way, they represent a shift in the regional climate that's happening too gradually for anyone to document, but that's nevertheless real and consequential. More rain means more water in the river system, which means gradual changes to where and how people can live. The storm approaches but doesn't quite arrive, the rain falling in visible curtains perhaps a mile away while you remain dry beneath your tamarisk tree. You can smell it though, that distinctive scent of rain on the wind, and watch as people throughout the settlement glance skyward, calculating odds, deciding whether to secure things or wait and see. A young couple walks past your tree, their body language suggesting they're looking for privacy, which is apparently difficult to find in a community where everyone lives within shouting distance of everyone else. They settle on a spot perhaps 50 yards away, far enough to feel separate but close enough that you could probably hear their conversation if you were inclined to eavesdrop, which you're not because that would be weird and also none of your business. The settlement's dogs suddenly become alert, their collective attention focused on something beyond the perimeter that you can't see from your position. Several adults notice and respond, moving to investigate whatever has caught the dog's interest. You watch as they confer, pointing toward the southern approach, eventually relaxing in a way that suggests recognized friends rather than unknown threats. A small group appears, travellers from another community based on the goods they're carrying. They're welcomed with what looks like genuine pleasure, people emerging from their heat-induced stupor to greet the newcomers, exchange news and inspect trade goods. It's a reminder that these settlements exist in networks, connected by regular travel and exchange, even across distances that would seem prohibitive to people accustomed to motorized transportation. The visitors have brought obsidian, you notice, chunks of volcanic glass that originated somewhere far to the north or east, and passed through who knows how many hands before arriving here. In exchange, they're receiving baskets, dried fish, and what appear to be finished leather goods. The exchange rates are negotiated through processes you can't follow, involving lots of discussion and occasional laughter, and what might be ritual elements, or might just be people being theatrical about commerce. As evening approaches, the temperature finally begins to moderate, dropping from, "Why did anyone think living here was a good idea?" to merely, "This is pretty uncomfortable." Activity throughout the settlement increases correspondingly. Fires are lit for cooking. Children emerge from wherever they've been avoiding the heat, resuming their eternal mission of being loud about everything. The visitors are being fed, with preparations for a communal meal underway that will probably extend long into the night. You realise you're watching the construction of social bonds that will become cultural memory, stories told and retold until they transform into something between history and myth. Someone from this settlement will eventually marry someone from the visiting group, creating kinship ties that obligate mutual support. Knowledge will be exchanged, where to find good flint, which plants have medicinal properties, and warnings about dangers encountered while travelling. The networks that sustain human communities in environments like this are built one interaction at a time through hospitality and trade and the simple act of sharing news around a fire. The fire has burned down to coals and someone is telling a story. You can't understand the words, but the cadence is familiar, the rhythm of a narrative that's been polished through countless retellings. The listeners respond at appropriate moments with laughter or solemn attention, or ritual phrases that might be the equivalent of "Amen," or "That's right," or "Tell it." This is entertainment, yes, but it's also education, history and cultural transmission all wrapped together in the oldest technology humans have for preserving knowledge across generations. The story seems to involve water, based on the gestures the storyteller makes, sweeping motions that might represent floods, cupped hands suggesting scarcity, and flowing movements indicating rivers. You suspect it's an origin story, explaining how the river came to follow its current path, or why the seasons change, or some other fundamental fact about the world that deserves explanation even if the explanation isn't technically accurate. An older child interrupts with a question, and the storyteller responds with what sounds like patient clarification, then continues the narrative. This is interactive storytelling, permitting questions and discussion, very different from the passive consumption of stories that future generations will experience through books and screens. The audience participates in creating the performance, their reactions shaping how the storyteller emphasizes different elements. You notice that the visiting traders are paying particular attention, occasionally exchanging glances that suggest they're hearing variations of stories they know from their own community. This is how stories spread, mutating slightly with each retelling, accumulating local details while maintaining core narrative elements. In a few hundred years, communities across this entire valley system will share flood myths that describe water swallowing the world, and scholars will eventually argue about whether these represent actual memories of post-glacial sea level rise or are purely symbolic. The answer, as usual, will probably be both. The story concludes with what sounds like a moral or lesson, prompting approving murmurs from the adults present. The children are released from paying attention and immediately resume whatever they were doing before story time commanded their focus. Some of the adults drift toward their dwellings, the day's labours finally complete. Others remain by the fire, talking in small groups, probably discussing ordinary things: who's planning to marry whom, whether someone's cough sounds serious, and the quality of this season's fishing. You stand and stretch, walking to the settlement's edge where the manufactured landscape gives way to the wild. The stars are emerging now, so many that the sky looks crowded, with the Milky Way visible as a dense river of light cutting across the darkness. These people navigate by these stars, track seasons by them, and tell stories about them. The night sky is both a useful tool and a sacred text, read and interpreted by everyone capable of staying awake past sunset. A shooting star scratches across the darkness, and you hear exclamations from the people still gathered by the fire. Someone says something that provokes laughter, probably a joke about wishes or omens or whatever cultural significance shooting stars hold in this community. The moment passes, the conversations resume, and life continues in its patient progression toward morning. You realise that time is moving differently here, not because physics has changed, but because human experience of time is elastic, shaped by the pace of change in our surroundings. In an environment where seasons cycle but years blend together, where one generation's life differs only marginally from the previous generation's, time becomes less linear and more cyclical. The past isn't clearly separated from the present because the present looks so much like the past. But the changes are accumulating, invisible to individuals but visible across generations. The river is slowly rising. The climate is slowly shifting. The distance to the sea, though no one here has ever seen the sea, is slowly shrinking as ocean levels climb millimetre by millimetre, century after century. The valley that seems eternal is actually temporary, already in the process of transforming into something completely different. A night bird calls from somewhere near the river, a sound that's probably territorial claiming or mate-seeking, but that could just as easily be the bird expressing opinions about the day's events. Another bird answers from a different direction, and for a moment you're witnessing a conversation in a language you'll never understand, between creatures that probably have more sophisticated thoughts than they're generally given credit for. The moon rises, nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows. People move through the settlement using moonlight for illumination, no one bothering with torches for simple tasks like visiting the latrine area, or checking on children who should be asleep but probably aren't. The dogs resettle themselves, finding new patches of ground that haven't yet absorbed their body heat, comfortable in the knowledge that their humans are nearby, and the night holds no immediate threats worth barking about. You find yourself wondering what these people would think if you could show them the future. Not the distant future of cities and technology, but the comparatively near future when their valley becomes a gulf, when their river mouths become harbours, when the landscape they know as solid ground becomes a seafloor supporting ecosystems they've never imagined? Would they believe you? Would it matter to them, given that the transformation will take so long that their great-great-grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren will still be adapting to changes that feel gradual rather than catastrophic? A woman emerges from a dwelling carrying a crying infant, walking with the practiced motion of someone who's soothed many babies through many nights. She paces near the dying fire, bouncing gently, murmuring words that probably combine comfort and mild frustration in the universal language of parents who need their child to please go to sleep. The baby's cries gradually subside into hiccuping whimpers, then silence. The woman continues pacing for a few more minutes, making sure the sleep has truly taken hold, before disappearing back into her dwelling, with the caution of someone who knows that creaky floorboards exist specifically to wake babies at inopportune moments. The settlement settles into deep night quiet, the kind of silence that only exists far from cities and highways and all the ambient noise of modern civilization. You can hear the river if you listen carefully, a distant murmur that never quite stops. Occasionally a dog shifts position with a jingle of whatever passes for a collar in this era. Someone snores with the enthusiasm of a person who's done physical labour all day and has no reason to sleep apologetically. You close your eyes and try to imagine this same spot millennia from now, when researchers in submarines will explore these ruins, shining lights through water that's replaced air, documenting artifacts that speak to lives lived when breathing didn't require scuba equipment. The stone walls will still be here, probably, enduring, because stone does that. The organic materials, the wood, the leather, the woven baskets, will have long since degraded, leaving only shadows in the sediment where they once existed. You're walking along the river again, but decades have passed, maybe a full human lifetime. The settlement you knew has expanded significantly, or perhaps several settlements have grown close enough to begin functioning as a single entity. The stone structures are more substantial now, some reaching full human height before the roof materials take over. Someone has figured out that mixing mud with straw creates a useful building material, and several walls show this innovation, their surfaces smoothed with practiced hands. The river itself is different in ways that would be subtle if you hadn't seen it before. The bank has retreated slightly, the water claiming land that used to be dry, not dramatically, perhaps 10 feet over the decades you've been away, but noticeably once you know to look. The people living here probably attribute it to normal variation, unusual rainfall, or the river being in one of its periodic moods. They're adjusting their infrastructure accordingly, moving wells slightly inland and rebuilding structures that sat too close to the water's edge. You find evidence of this adaptation everywhere. The original well you saw is still in use, but someone has constructed a second one, positioned on higher ground. Several dwellings show signs of recent relocation and new construction on sites that offer better protection from flooding. A stone wall runs along part of the riverbank, not tall enough to prevent serious flooding, but sufficient to provide warning and buy time for moving valuable possessions to higher ground. An elderly man is directing younger workers in the maintenance of this wall, pointing out sections where stones have shifted or need replacing, or where the wall should be extended. His hands move with the authority of someone who's earned the right to give orders through demonstrated competence rather than imposed hierarchy. The workers respond with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but they respond, suggesting this man's knowledge is valued even if his personality might be occasionally difficult. You notice something interesting about the settlement's layout. There's a clear demarcation between older structures close to the river and newer construction at higher elevations. It's not a conscious planned response to rising water. These people don't think in those terms, but rather a practical adaptation to observed patterns. Floods have been getting more frequent, so new building happens where floods don't reach. Simple cause and effect, no theoretical framework required. A group of children plays in the shallows where the river has created a gentle backwater, their laughter carrying across the settlement. They're practicing swimming, or at least staying afloat. skills that previous generations probably didn't prioritise but that are becoming more important as water becomes more prevalent in daily life. An adult watches from the bank, ready to intervene if anyone gets into trouble, casual supervision that suggests this is normal activity rather than anything risky. The communal area has evolved too. What was once a simple fire pit has become something more elaborate. A permanent hearth with stones arranged to create multiple cooking surfaces, surrounded by flat rocks that serve as seating. Someone has created shade structures using wooden frames and woven mats, providing relief from the sun during the day and gathering spaces that encourage social interaction. The whole arrangement suggests a community that expects to be here for a while, investing in infrastructure that will serve multiple generations. You spot the old woman who is teaching basket weaving, or perhaps it's her daughter or granddaughter. At this remove, it's genuinely difficult to tell. She's engaged in the same activity, surrounded by children in various stages of paying attention. The eternal cycle of knowledge transmission continuing regardless of individual participants. One girl shows the same aptitude you saw decades ago, her fingers moving with confidence, and you wonder if she's a descendant of that earlier skilled child, or if manual dexterity just runs strong in this community. Trade goods are more varied now, suggesting expanded networks or more frequent contact with distant groups. You see items that clearly originated far away, shells from what must be the Mediterranean, copper that probably came from Anatolia, and stones with unusual properties that suggest volcanic origins. These objects represent not just commerce but relationships, the social bonds that make trade possible across distances that would take weeks to traverse on foot. The river valley itself is showing signs of gradual transformation. Areas that were dry scrubland in the past now support denser vegetation, with plants that need reliable water thriving in conditions that support them. Birds you didn't see before are now common, with species that prefer wetland environments taking advantage of the expanded aquatic habitat. The ecology is shifting in response to changing conditions, though again, no single generation would notice the transformation. An argument breaks out near the communal hearth, voices raised in the universal tone of people who fundamentally disagree about something important. You can't understand the specific issue, but the body language suggests it's related to resource allocation. Who gets to use which fishing spots perhaps, or whether certain areas should be reserved for gathering rather than allowed for general use. Several elders intervene, not with authority imposed from above but through facilitation, helping the disputants find compromise without anyone losing face. The resolution involves everyone walking to the river to look at something, gesturing at water levels and landmarks, and eventually nodding in apparent agreement. It's conflict resolution at its most basic. Look at the actual situation together, discuss what's reasonable, and find a solution that everyone can live with even if nobody's completely satisfied. It works, in its way, as evidenced by the fact that this community has persisted across generations without apparently tearing itself apart over disputes. You realise you're watching the development of governance structures, though calling them structures might be too formal. These are the proto-institutions that will eventually evolve into more complex social organisations, but right now they're just people figuring out how to live together without constant conflict. The rules are mostly unwritten, enforced through social pressure and accumulated tradition rather than any formal legal code. A young mother sits in the shade nursing an infant, simultaneously supervising two older children who are engaged in the eternal childhood activity of turning ordinary objects into toys. They've found some clay from the riverbank and are moulding it into shapes that might be animals or might be abstract sculptures or might just be clay that feels good to squish. The mother watches them with the expression of someone who's seen this particular show many times before but still finds it moderately entertaining. The day progresses toward afternoon, and you notice that the rhythm of activity has adjusted to accommodate more water in the immediate environment. Morning tasks now include checking for overnight flooding, a concern that apparently wasn't pressing in earlier generations. Several people are working on a raised platform near the river, creating a structure that will keep stored goods above potential flood levels. It's adaptation in real time, practical responses to observed problems. You walk to the higher ground where the newest construction is happening and turn to look back at the settlement. From this vantage point, the community's relationship with water becomes even more apparent. The river dominates the view, broader than you remember, its presence more commanding. The settlement arranges itself in relation to this water, with structures and paths and activity all oriented toward the source of life, even as everyone's simultaneously wary of its potential for destruction. Clouds build in the familiar afternoon pattern, and you realise these storms are definitely more frequent now. What was occasional in the past is becoming regular, the shift in precipitation patterns clear to anyone paying attention across decades rather than years. The people here aren't paying attention across decades, though. They're living their individual lives, responding to immediate conditions, and making the best decisions they can with the information available. The rain arrives, and everyone responds with practiced efficiency. Goods are moved under cover, children are herded into dwellings, and fires are protected or abandoned depending on their importance. It's not panic, just a practiced response to a familiar challenge. The rain itself seems heavier than you remember, fat drops that hit with enough force to splash mud. The kind of precipitation that suggests the atmosphere is holding more moisture than it used to. You find shelter in one of the newer structures, more sophisticated than the earlier buildings, with walls that actually repel water rather than merely slowing its entrance. The roof is properly thatched, with overlapping layers of dried vegetation that shed rain with impressive efficiency. Someone has figured out principles of water resistance through trial and error, knowledge now applied across the community. From inside, you listen to the rain drum against the roof, watch water stream past the entrance, and observe how the ground outside becomes increasingly saturated. This particular storm doesn't cause flooding, but you can see how a few more inches of rain would start to threaten lower-lying structures. The margin of safety is narrowing, the buffer between normal weather and disaster gradually shrinking, as water becomes more prevalent throughout the landscape. When the rain passes, you emerge to find the settlement transformed into a network of puddles and streams, temporary watercourses that will drain away over the next few hours, but that currently make navigation challenging. Children immediately treat this as an entertainment opportunity, splashing through the water with delight that adults probably don't share. A few dogs join in, because of course they do, ending up muddy and pleased with themselves. The river has risen noticeably, even from this single storm. It's not threatening yet, but it's louder and more present, the sound of increased flow audible even at a distance. You watch as several adults walk to the bank to assess the situation, pointing at landmarks, discussing what this means for the coming days. If the rain continues, they'll need to move more goods to higher ground, and possibly evacuate some structures temporarily. This is life in a changing climate, though nobody's using those words. This is adaptation, resilience, and community response to environmental conditions that are shifting just fast enough to require attention, but not so fast that traditional coping mechanisms fail completely. Yet. You're travelling with a group of traders now, people who specialise in moving goods between communities scattered across the valley system. They're tough, in the way that people who spend most of their lives walking are tough. Their bodies lean and efficient, their feet so calloused they barely bother with sandals. The group consists of 6 adults and 2 adolescents who are apparently learning the trade, experiencing firsthand the routes they'll eventually travel independently. The landscape they're traversing would have been entirely different a few generations ago. Where there used to be dry gullies, there are now seasonal streams that require fording with care. What were challenging but passable mudflats have become actual wetlands, complete with reeds and waterbirds and ground that sucks at your feet with every step. The traders know all of this intimately, adjusting their routes in response to changing conditions, finding new paths when old ones become impassable. You're crossing what used to be a reliable ford, but the water's higher now, reaching mid-thigh on the adults and nearly waist-high on the adolescents. Everyone's carrying their trade goods overhead, moving carefully to maintain balance on a river bottom that's slippery with algae and unclear through the brown water. One of the adolescents stumbles but catches themselves, earning a sharp comment from an older trader that probably translates to something like, "Pay attention before you drop everything we've carried for the last week." The opposite bank is muddy from recent flooding, making the exit from the river more challenging than the crossing itself. People haul themselves up using exposed tree roots, then turn to help those still in the water, the whole operation requiring cooperation and mutual support. Once everyone's safely across, there's a pause for reorganisation, checking that nothing got wet that shouldn't have, and redistributing loads that shifted during the crossing. You notice that the traders are carrying different goods than you saw in earlier times. There's less obsidian and more preserved fish, fewer stone tools, more ceramic vessels. The trade patterns are adapting to changing resource availability and shifting demand. Communities that used to specialise in one type of production have diversified or pivoted entirely, responding to market forces that nobody's theorising about but everyone's experiencing. The route follows higher ground now, avoiding areas that have become too wet for reliable passage. This adds distance to the journey, but eliminates the risk of getting stuck in mud or having to detour around unexpected flooding. The traders move with steady efficiency, maintaining a pace that covers ground without exhausting anyone. They're marathon runners, not sprinters, their entire strategy built around sustainable effort over multiple days. You pass evidence of abandoned settlements, structures that were built too close to water that's since claimed them. Stone walls emerge from shallow pools, their upper portions still visible above the waterline. Hearths that once centred family life now sit beneath inches of standing water, algae growing on stones that were selected for their heat retention properties. Nobody seems to find this remarkable. It's just how things are, the normal progression of a landscape where water keeps expanding its territory. A more active settlement appears in the distance, positioned on ground high enough to have avoided the flooding that claimed its neighbours. Smoke rises from multiple hearths, and you can see people moving around even from this distance. The traders increase their pace slightly, motivated by the prospect of reaching their destination, completing transactions, and resting before beginning the return journey. The settlement is larger than others you've seen, benefiting from its strategic position on high ground at a confluence of trade routes. Perhaps 50 structures cluster together, representing a population that might reach 200 people if you include children. This is approaching the upper limit of what this technology and social organisation can support. Any larger, and the community would probably split, with some group deciding to establish a daughter settlement elsewhere. The traders are greeted with genuine warmth, suggesting they're regular visitors whose arrival is anticipated. Children run out to meet them, excited by the prospect of new goods and stories from other communities. Adults emerge from dwellings and work areas, wiping hands on clothing, preparing to engage in the social rituals that surround trade. The actual trading happens in the communal area, with goods spread out on woven mats for inspection and discussion. This isn't silent commerce. There's extensive negotiation, people handling goods, asking questions and making counter-offers. The traders have stories about where each item came from, who made it, and what special properties it might have. These narratives add value, transforming simple objects into pieces of a larger world that most people in this settlement will never directly experience. You watch as a particularly fine ceramic vessel generates intense interest. It's larger and thinner walled than the local pottery, fired at higher temperatures based on its colour and hardness. The trader explains that it comes from a community 2 weeks' journey to the east, where someone has figured out kiln technology that achieves temperatures the local potters can't match. The asking price is high, multiple baskets of dried fish, some worked leather, and a quantity of that mysterious resource called future obligation. The negotiation takes hours, involving multiple community members who apparently have various claims to the resources being offered. There's no central authority deciding who gets what. Instead, there's extended discussion, occasional arguments, and eventual consensus. The process is inefficient by modern standards, but has the advantage of ensuring everyone feels heard and that agreements have broad support. While trading continues, the adolescent apprentices are getting a tour of the settlement from local young people. You follow along, observing how the hosts show off their community's achievements with obvious pride. They've got an impressive water storage system, multiple connected basins that collect runoff and provide a reserve supply during dry periods. Someone has figured out basic water purification using sand filters, a technological innovation that's reduced waterborne illness significantly. The local river system is more complex here, with multiple channels braiding through the landscape in patterns that change seasonally. The settlement has adapted to this by creating a network of bridges and fords, stone causeways that provide reliable passage even when water levels fluctuate. It represents massive labour investment and generations of work-building infrastructure that makes this location viable, despite challenging hydrology. You notice something else: the community's garbage disposal strategy. Middens are positioned carefully downslope from living areas, and there's clear attention to preventing contamination of water sources. This isn't modern sanitation engineering, but it's thoughtful waste management that reflects understanding of how disease spreads. The settlement is cleaner than others you've visited, and you suspect lower illness rates are one reason it's grown larger. As evening approaches, the traders are invited to share a communal meal, compensation for the goods they've brought, and incentive to return in the future. The meal is more elaborate than everyday fare. Fish grilled over open fires, some kind of grain porridge flavoured with herbs you don't recognise, and dates that must have come from one of those oasis settlements you passed earlier. It's festival food, a celebration of successful trade and continued relationships. The conversation during dinner is animated, with traders sharing news from other communities, locals asking questions about distant places, and everyone participating in the ancient human joy of gossip and storytelling. You learn that a settlement 3 days south has been completely abandoned due to flooding. Another community to the east is thriving, having found a reliable freshwater spring that's attracted additional families. Someone's daughter has married into a distant group, creating new kinship networks. A particularly skilled toolmaker has died, and his knowledge died with him because his children pursued different skills. These are the information networks that connect communities across vast distances long before any written records exist. News travels at walking pace, filtered through memory and interpretation, probably getting distorted in the process, but still serving to keep far-flung groups aware of each other's circumstances. It's how people know where to go during famines, which communities are accepting newcomers, and where resources might be available. After dinner, someone produces a musical instrument, a simple flute carved from bone, and begins playing. The melody is haunting, built on scales that don't quite match anything in your musical experience, but that work according to their own internal logic. Others join in, clapping rhythms, adding vocal harmonies, and creating sound that serves no practical purpose, but fulfills some deep human need for artistic expression. Children fall asleep where they sit, the day's excitement finally overwhelming their determination to stay awake. Adults continue talking long into the night. The traders are clearly valued not just for their goods, but for their role as information carriers, connecting isolated communities into something approaching a network. This is society at its most fundamental, people finding ways to cooperate and connect across distances, building relationships that transcend immediate family or local group. You realise that this network of trade and communication will adapt remarkably well to the coming changes. When the water rises enough to make land routes difficult, people will take to boats, maintaining connections across expanding water bodies. The settlements that survive will be those that adapt their trading practices to aquatic environments, that learn to navigate by coastal landmarks, and that figure out boat building and sail making and all the maritime technologies that will become necessary as the Gulf forms. The fire burns lower, conversations become quieter, and people drift towards sleep in whatever sheltered spaces they've claimed for the night. The traders bed down in a structure apparently reserved for visitors, the adolescent apprentices already snoring with the easy sleep of young people who've walked all day. You find your own sleeping spot and settle in, listening to the night sounds of a community at rest, knowing that tomorrow the traders will begin their return journey, carrying new goods and new stories back to the communities they came from. You're underwater now, or rather, you're observing what lies beneath modern waters, structures and artifacts that once existed in the dry air you've been breathing. This is the same location you've been visiting, but millennia have passed and the sea has claimed everything. The transformation happened so gradually that it never felt catastrophic to the people experiencing it, just a series of adjustments that eventually added up to complete environmental change. The stone foundations you're seeing were built by people who never imagined they'd end up beneath the Persian Gulf. The walls are still there, arranged in patterns that clearly indicate human design, but they're covered in marine growth now, home to creatures that would have seemed alien to the original builders. Small fish dart through doorways that once framed human comings and goings. Seaweed waves in currents that follow the same basic patterns as the winds that used to blow across the valley floor. An archaeologist working from a research vessel has sent down a remotely operated vehicle, and you're watching through its cameras as it explores these ruins. The excitement in the control room is palpable. This is a significant finding, evidence of occupation in an area that wasn't supposed to have been habitable when these structures were built. Except it was habitable, obviously, because here are the buildings, here are the tools, and here are the undeniable traces of human life in a location that current models suggested should have been underwater at the time. The researchers are already revising their timelines, adjusting their understanding of when the Gulf flooded, how quickly the water rose, and what areas remained accessible longest. They're doing this based on radiocarbon dating of organic materials trapped in the sediment, correlating their findings with geological evidence from sediment cores and comparing notes with other research teams exploring different sections of the seafloor. They find a well, the same well you watched people dig and line with carefully selected stones thousands of years ago. It's still structurally sound, though filled with sediment now. The rope grooves you noticed were worn smooth by generations of use. The archaeologist directing the ROV lingers on this feature, clearly recognising it for what it is, probably already drafting the paper that will argue for earlier and more extensive human settlement in the Persian Gulf region than previously believed. More structures emerge from the sediment as the ROV continues its survey. The settlement you knew as a thriving community exists now as an underwater archaeological site, every stone wall and hearth and storage pit transformed into data points in someone's dissertation. The researchers catalogue everything with painstaking care, creating digital models that will allow them to reconstruct the settlement's layout, estimate population, and theorise about social organisation and economic activities. They find ceramics, or rather ceramic fragments, sherds that once belonged to the vessels you watched people making and using and trading. The pottery has survived remarkably well, protected by sediment that covered it quickly enough to prevent complete dissolution, but gently enough that pieces remained largely intact. Someone will spend months analysing these sherds, categorising them by style and manufacturing technique, and using them to argue about trade networks and cultural connections between distant communities. The ROV's manipulator arm carefully retrieves a particularly intact piece, part of a large storage vessel that still shows finger marks from the potter who shaped it. You remember watching someone make pottery in this settlement, their hands moving with practiced confidence, creating containers that would store grain and water and oil. Those hands are bones now, long since returned to the cycle of elements, but their work persists, transformed into archaeological evidence of lives that mattered to the people living them, even if they were ultimately forgotten by everyone who came after. A heated discussion breaks out in the control room. Some researchers argue these structures prove permanent settlement in areas previously thought too marginal. Others suggest they might represent seasonal occupation, people using the area during periods of lower water levels. A third faction thinks the whole thing requires fundamentally rethinking the timeline of human habitation in the Gulf region. They're all partially right, but none of them can access the complete picture you've witnessed. The gradual changes, the incremental adaptations, the way people simply lived their lives while the world slowly transformed around them. The ROV moves to a different section of the site, revealing what appears to be a communal area. The stones arranged in a circle could be a hearth, though the researchers debate this, some arguing it might be a structure foundation, or even a natural formation. You want to tell them it's definitely a hearth. You sat near it while people cooked and told stories and argued about resource allocation. But you can't. So instead you watch them carefully measure and photograph and sample, turning human experience into quantifiable data. They discover something unexpected, a layer of shells that doesn't fit the regional pattern. These aren't local marine species, but freshwater mollusks, exactly like the ones you saw people collecting and sorting and stringing into trade goods. The researchers puzzle over this, eventually theorizing that the site might have been occupied during a freshwater phase before marine conditions established themselves. They're right, though their timeline estimates are still off by several thousand years. The sediment around the structures tells its own story. Lower layers contain pollen from drought-adapted plants, suggesting arid conditions. Higher layers show an increasing presence of wetland species, documenting the gradual transition toward wetter conditions. The very top layers, just before marine sediments completely take over, contain evidence of extensive flooding. Not single catastrophic events, but repeated inundations that eventually made continued occupation impossible. You imagine the final generations who lived here, watching as the floods became more frequent. The water took longer to recede, and the intervals between floods grew shorter. They probably didn't think of it as their settlement being swallowed by the sea. The sea was still far away, over the horizon, a concept most of them had never directly experienced. They just knew that their traditional location was becoming less viable, that they needed to move to higher ground, and that the old stories about their ancestors living in this spot might need to become stories about finding a new spot. The researchers find evidence of this gradual abandonment in the archaeological record. The more portable, valuable items are missing, suggesting people had time to pack up and leave rather than fleeing from sudden disaster. The structures show signs of planned decommissioning, certain features carefully filled in, others left open in ways that suggest people intended to return but never did. It's the archaeology of orderly retreat, communities adapting to changing conditions in real time. A particularly exciting find emerges from beneath a collapsed wall. Carved stone, not functional tools but decorative or possibly ritual objects. The researchers can barely contain their enthusiasm. These are rare finds, the kind that make careers and fill museum displays and inspire popular documentaries about lost civilizations. They document every angle, take multiple samples for dating, and carefully retrieve the artifacts for further study. You recognize one of the carved stones. You saw it being worked on. Watch someone spend weeks chipping and grinding and polishing, creating something beautiful for reasons that probably made perfect sense to them, but that you never fully understood. Now it's a museum piece, an artifact that will be studied and theorized about and possibly misinterpreted by people who never met its creator, never understood the context that made it meaningful. The ROV's survey continues, revealing more of the settlement with each passing hour. The researchers are already planning return expeditions, more extensive excavations and detailed studies that will take years to complete. This site will become famous in archaeological circles as a key piece of evidence in understanding human adaptation to climate change, migration patterns in response to environmental shifts, and the resilience and ingenuity of early communities facing existential challenges. But for all their careful analysis and sophisticated techniques, the researchers will never fully grasp what you've witnessed. The lived experience of people who called this place home, who raised children and told stories and argued about fish trading rights and built wells, and hoped their grandchildren would benefit from their labour. The human dimension of archaeology is always somewhat inaccessible. reduced to inference and educated guessing based on material remains that can't fully convey what it meant to exist in a particular time and place. The submersible's lights illuminate a final section of the site, revealing what might have been the settlement's newest construction. Structures positioned on the highest available ground, built by people who understood that the water was coming and were trying to buy themselves a few more generations of occupation. The walls are more substantial here, clearly designed to resist flooding, incorporating lessons learned from watching earlier structures succumb to rising water. But eventually, even the highest ground wasn't high enough. The water won. The way water always wins given sufficient time. The settlement was abandoned, the structures slowly filled with sediment, the stories were forgotten or transformed into myths, and the physical evidence waited beneath the waves for researchers with submersibles and carbon dating to discover it and try to piece together what happened. You surface with the ROV, leaving the drowned settlement to its marine inhabitants. The research vessel rocks gently in the Gulf's shallow waters, and you reflect on the strange journey you've taken. From walking through a dry valley to swimming above the same locations, from watching people live their lives to watching researchers study the remains of those lives. It's a reminder that landscapes are temporary. Human occupation is always contingent on environmental conditions, and the only constant is change. You're standing on what will eventually become the Strait of Hormuz, but right now it's a narrow valley connecting two larger valleys, a bottleneck that constrains water flow during the wet season and serves as a convenient passage point during drier times. The landscape here is more dramatic than the river valleys you've been exploring. Steep rocky walls rise on either side, carved by millions of years of water action during periods when this region has been underwater in the deep geological past. A small community occupies a sheltered area where an underground spring emerges from the rock. The spring has been flowing for thousands of years, creating a reliable water source that makes human habitation possible in an otherwise harsh environment. People have built stone walls to channel the spring's output into usable pools, creating a small oasis that supports perhaps 30 people and attracts passing travellers who need to refill water containers before continuing their journeys. You notice that the community members here have a different appearance than the people you've been encountering in the main valley. Slightly different facial features, skin tones and body proportions. This suggests they represent a different migration stream. People who came from somewhere else and established themselves in this location because it offered the resources they needed. Trade goods scattered throughout the settlement include items from both the northern valleys and what must be southern regions beyond the current boundary of your travels. The strait itself is dry right now, a rocky passage that could be walked from one end to the other in perhaps half a day, but the stone walls on either side show clear evidence of water action, polishing, erosion patterns and deposits of materials that could only have been carried by flowing water. This place has been underwater before, in the distant past, and will be underwater again in the future, though the people living here have no way of knowing this. An older man gestures for you to follow him to a particular rock face, where someone long ago scratched marks that might be astronomical observations, or might be territorial claims, or might be art for art's sake. He explains something in his language, clearly proud of these marks, treating them as important cultural heritage. You study them carefully, noting how weathering has softened the lines, how lichen has colonized the protected crevices, and how these marks connect present inhabitants to ancestors who stood in this same spot centuries earlier. The spring produces perhaps 20 gallons per minute, enough to support the current population but not much more. You suspect this places a natural limit on community size. More people would strain the water supply, forcing some to leave or risk everyone suffering shortages. It's another example of how environmental factors shape human possibilities, creating constraints that determine social organisation without anyone consciously planning it. The settlement's trading role is evident in the variety of goods passing through. Shells from the Indian Ocean mix with minerals from mountain regions and plant materials from river valleys, pile next to marine products from coastal areas you haven't visited. The people here serve as intermediaries, facilitating exchange between groups that never directly meet, taking a percentage of everything that passes through as payment for their services. You climb to a high point overlooking the strait and sit, trying to imagine what this place will look like when the ocean finally breaches the barrier to the south. The narrow valley will become a strategic waterway. The rocky walls that now provide shelter will become dangerous currents that require skilled navigation. The spring that currently sustains a small community will still flow, but it will empty into salt water, becoming a curiosity rather than a lifeline. The transformation will happen slowly enough that people will adapt. Settlements will shift from trade in portable goods to trade in maritime services, piloting, provisioning, and ship repair. The knowledge that allowed people to survive in this harsh landscape will be replaced by knowledge of tides and currents and wind patterns. The continuity will be human presence, the human drive to find ways to thrive even in changing circumstances. As the sun sets, the temperature drops noticeably, the desert landscape giving up its heat with the same enthusiasm it absorbed it during the day. Stars emerge in stunning profusion, and someone points out constellations that apparently have names and stories, connecting the people in this small settlement to the larger universe in ways that are both practical and spiritual. You settle in for the night, listening to conversations you can't understand, watching stars wheel across the sky, and contemplating the enormous span of time that separates these people from you, and the even larger span that separates them from the researchers who will eventually explore their drowned settlements and try to piece together what their lives were like. Tomorrow the water will be fractionally higher, the changes fractionally more apparent, and the transformation of valley to gulf fractionally closer to completion. But tonight, this is still a dry strait, still a place where humans walk rather than sail, still a world on the verge of transformation that no single lifetime will witness in completion. The fire burns down to coals, conversations quiet, and sleep claims another day in the long, slow story of how a valley became a gulf, how dry land became seafloor, and how human communities adapted and survived and left traces that would puzzle researchers thousands of years later. The wind picks up slightly, carrying the faint smell of salt that suggests the ocean, though still distant, is nevertheless closer than it was yesterday. You close your eyes and drift towards sleep, your final thought being a question. In 10,000 years, what will researchers make of our drowned cities, our submerged infrastructure, and our traces left behind as the next transformation unfolds? The answer, like the future itself, remains unwritten, waiting to be discovered by curious minds not yet born.